Hello, everyone. Good to see some familiar faces from yesterday. We will get started with our next panel discussion on climate governance and corporate form. For those joining us online, please access the link for your that's dropped in the chat for your MCLE credits. I'll ask to join on stage Ofer Elder, professor at Berkeley Law, to introduce the rest of our panelists. Please put your hands together for the next panel.
Okay, I'm very delighted to be here in the Climate Summit, and we have a wonderful panel to talk about climate in legal form, and I guess more generally about corporate governance. So our panelists are first Susan McCormack, who is a partner in Morrison & Foster's and head of the ESG practice, and I should say Susan is more like a pioneer in this area. And then we have Dominique Alepin, who until recently was Assistant General Counsel responsible for ESG regulatory compliance at Nike. And we have also Rama Varian Kaval. Did I pronounce it right? Okay, so he is the Global Head of Corporate Advisory and Sustainable Solutions at JP Morgan. So with that, I'll let Susan, why don't you start and take us through the history of climate governance, the new legal form, how are these all related? It's kind of confusing. There's so many legal forms out there. There's B Corp certifications, there's benefit corporation. What do we need to know?
Well, I think what you need to know is that it's not new. And for those of you who are Berkeleyites, how many are Berkeley Law School here? Mel Eisenberg. So the American Law Institute, which I'm honored to be a part of, wrote in the 1970s, and the ALI put together sort of the top corporate lawyers across the country, mainly in New York, but a few out here as well, and put together a several volume set called The Principles of Corporate Governance. And for all of the law students and corporate lawyers, that is really the foundation behind most of the corporate laws in most states, including Delaware. We're right now in the process of writing the restatement for those principles of corporate governance. But that multi-volume set actually has an entire chapter on this issue that was drafted by Professor Eisenberg here at Berkeley. And it basically said there is a missing link within the corporate structure. And from my perspective, it is the difference between may versus shall. It's whether or not a board and management must consider stakeholders and factors in addition to shareholders, or whether they can. And the key from a governance perspective is since the 70s, there's a lot of work that has been done with CAN. And one of the reasons I was really happy that Dominique is coming from Nike, there are many, many large companies, JP Morgan and Nike as two, that do an incredible amount related to climate. And it's set at the governance level. It's set at their board level. It's set through their committee structure. And this was way ahead of there being any regulatory requirements, any disclosure requirements. There was an incredible amount of work that was done and that can be done. And really the difference is that there are people like me who believe it's just not going to happen fast enough, and also that companies need a shield from shareholder liability if they want to go faster. So if you are a fossil fuel company and you want to engage in energy transition more quickly, but it's going to take significant capital expenditures and your stock price is going to take a hit, if you're one of the new corporate forms, you could actually have a shield because you would have dual fiduciary duties. You would have an obligation to consider climate in addition to considering shareholder value. But that's the framework. And so I teach climate governance here at Berkeley, and I think it's important. The nice, bright, shiny new bauble are these new corporate forms. There's B Corp certification, which is just a certification, but there's a benefit corporation, special purpose corporation, flexible purpose corporation, and the public benefit corporation. The one thing I'll just say is that state by state, all of these are different, but they do all relate to the fact that they all have sort of this fiduciary duty to one or a series of socially responsible and environmentally responsible factors. But there's a lot you can do with the existing form as well within governance. And when we come a little bit later, I would just say that there are companies like Flexport and SpaceX with Starlink and many, many others that have a normal corporate form and a fiscally sponsored public charity on the side that are having considerable impact. In fact, these new corporate forms with existing for-profit entities are providing about 80% of the aid into Gaza right now. So normal companies with their balance sheets have not been able to do it. These companies have. So this is a real viable solution, and it goes across. So that's just a little history starting back in the 70s.
Okay, so you mentioned, there are many, many forms out there. I guess, can you take us through a little bit, what are the main differences, main categories? Does it matter if you are a flexible purpose company or a benefit corporation? Does it matter if you're in Delaware, if you're in Vermont? What is
There
really
are
out there?
two, I'll just say quickly, and if anybody wants to follow up after, I can talk about this for hours as the people who are in my class. I am going to do this in a minute or two. There are two basic flavors. So every state is different. So when you read the press out there, they all label them benefit corporations or call them B Corp. B Corp is a certification. You license the mark. You take a 200-factor test. And if you score 80 or 70 or 80 or above, you can license the mark. You pay to license the mark. The underlying corporate forms fall generally into two categories. One is essentially shareholder rights, and this is Delaware and the Social Purpose Corporation in California, where the shareholders with the board and management say, we're going to have one or we're going to have many, but we're going to agree what the public benefit is, and we have a fiduciary duty, and we have to report, we have to consider stakeholders, but we don't have a fiduciary duty to those stakeholders, and that's a really, really key difference. The other forms are generally in the flavor that they have legislated good, so they have put into the statute, if you are a benefit corporation in California or New York, for example, there are 15 factors that you have to focus on and you have a fiduciary duty to. I would say, and Rama and Dominique can attest, in terms of taking outside capital and scaling, the benefit corporation doesn't work because, for example, if you have employees are on that list, you have a fiduciary duty to employees. If you're going through a downturn, can you have a reduction in force if you have a fiduciary duty or to employees? The benefit corporation also has a third-party enforcement proceeding within that statute. So unlike the public benefit corporation, if Chevron were to convert to a public benefit corporation, they would be protected from liability if they engaged in faster transition. With the benefit corporation, because of the third party, they would have increased risk because there's an additional mechanism, enforcement mechanisms for shareholders and in some states non-shareholders to be able to sue. So there are some other differences with the statutes, but the two major are, do you let your shareholders determine what the public benefit? And then you can link it to profitability in a way that we've talked about. And JP Morgan's actually had a shareholder resolution for a while now asking them to convert, or, as has Exxon, or do you follow what is legislated? And that's a policy difference. But from an investability and a scale, we represent both. So Patagonia is a California benefit corporation, closely held. It is fine with a statutory requirement that it focus on 15 factors, generate capital, is, as you'll hear from Daryl this afternoon, is a public benefit corporation. All 22 companies that have gone public are in Category 1 under Delaware. They're all public benefit corporations. Was that fast enough?
So, Rama, what are the odds that JP Morgan will turn
Are you going to convert?
Benefit?
So you will correct me. I think the requirement is what? A simple majority of shareholders have to agree?
Yes.
So if you can convince 50% of JP Morgan shareholder base to agree to it, Sure. I, I don't think that's going to happen, right? Because um, I think, Suze, your point is the right one. I don't think the PBC is a requirement, right? If you have the appropriate governance and you can kind of, get to where you need to get to. I think JP Morgan might be one of 15 or 20 companies who get this PBC proposal in our resolution, in our proxy season regularly. None of them have garnered more than, I think, 5% vote. So that the shareholders have spoken. I don't think they're ready.
Not yet.
Suze can be very convincing. One thing, especially about the type 1 of legal form, it never really struck me as, dramatically different than a standard corporation. In part because, many states already have some kind of constituency statute that basically permits managers, the board, to consider other stakeholders. And, arguably, even under Delaware law, you are permitted to do so, the Unicode standards, right? I mean, I teach that as well. So I don't know, do you have, what's your take on that? Is it really that different? And then, I mean, that would be a nice segue to hearing about public firms as well and what they do. But
Is it that different? I mean, it is, as I stated, it is the difference between may versus shall.
mm-hmm.
It is being viewed in M&A circles as a sweet pill. So if in a change of control situation, if you were a PBC, you could turn down a higher offer, just like, I mean, it's the reason constituency statutes are there. They were originally put in place in the 80s as anti-takeover devices. So you can say no to the higher offer if you do not have a reasonable belief at the board that the acquiring party is not going to focus. But another key is transparency. So unlike the constituency statute where, you could say, I'm going to focus on employees and then take all the money and go off to Tahiti and your investors won't know for some period of time, which has always been my issue with relying on the constituency statutes. The PBC requires regular reporting. The SBC requires even more regular reporting to shareholders, really granularly about what the impact KPIs, the benefit KPIs are, and how you're meeting them at the board level. So the transparency and all the discussion yesterday tying into the transparency is key. And I want to say, of the top, we're at a climate conference, but the top 10 AI companies in this country are all using corporate forms, and I did not see this coming. They're doing it for a variety of reasons. They're doing it as a public benefit corporation. They're doing this in Nevada and in Delaware, and many of them are hybrids, nonprofit, for-profit, which we'll get to, which is just as viable form. That's what I was talking about with the companies, with the solutions for aid to Gaza. But I mean, they're doing it because they want to stand up to the public and to the regulators, and they want to build into their infrastructure that their developers are going to be considering stakeholders in addition to shareholders in developing AI. That's why they are doing it. Again, I'm not prescient. I didn't see that coming, but it has just been a fascinating development. And they very much believe, the boards and management, that this can change. But if we're going to go to Nike and JP Morgan, there are large companies, that are in fact, fundamentally changing how they operate without the new corporate form.
Okay, great. So with that, I'd like to hear a little bit from Dominique, a little bit about the public firms, right? So of course, we talk about, we expect the hybrid firms or the benefit corporations, the PBC, to be very involved in social issues and climate risk in particular. But so what's going on in standard corporations, right? What have they started doing about climate risk?
Yes. So I think similar to what Suze was discussing, I think we are undergoing a transition, right? I think a lot of companies have been very focused on corporate social responsibility, really being run by marketing and communications, and it being the accountability for corporate social responsibility, reporting targets, goals, being driven by that part of the company. And a lot of, as Sue's mentioned, boards also have a corporate social responsibility committee that oversees the reporting as well as the targets, the purpose of the company. What is happening in large corporations that are subject to some of the regulations like CSRD, California climate bills, the SEC rule is accountability is shifting internally to legal and controlling teams who are taking a look at these matters from more of a risk lens, right? Mainly focused by the remit of these regulations that have you look at material impacts, risks, and opportunities with the input of your stakeholders. And so as that accountability shifts, I think you're seeing a shift in an understanding of what is really material to the company. If you look at it not from a consumer or investor or how we can, look better in the market, but more, no, what is like really material to the company? What issues should we be focusing on? That is shifting the narrative internally. And that discussion is also happening at the board level, right? I think where the CSR committee was more focused on, okay, well, at a high level, what is our purpose? And at a high level, what are we demonstrating? It's now focused, even shifting to an audit committee who's looking at what are the controls that we have in place in order to do reporting? What is the governance that we have to be able to address our material impacts, risks, and opportunities? Is our chief sustainability officer in the right place? Do they have a sufficient team to be able to address the risks that our legal team are now telling us that we should be keeping track of? So you are seeing, or I think you will see, a shift in the next 3 years as that transformation takes place internally. I think one of the examples of this is Unilever, who has always been a leader in this corporate social responsibility space and had a very broad mandate to the number of issues that they would address. Recently, last year, they came out and said, there are only a few issues that are actually that material to us and where we believe that we can make an impact on those issues. And that happened to coincide with preparation for their CSRD report, where again, their legal team, their controlling team is really in there getting at what are the material impacts, risks, and opportunities that we need to present or need to address.
Yeah, so I have a question about that. So, and maybe Unilever is an interesting example. To what extent the issues that these companies are focused on really reflect their own sort of business risks, or to what extent these are issues that are, so to speak, mission critical for the company, right? Or are these part of some kind of philanthropic or CSR activity that reflects maybe the preferences or the views of the shareholders or the managers? I mean, what is the purpose of it, really?
So I think previously, I think CSR has really been driven by, as you said, right? Like, what are our NGOs saying? What are our investors saying? What are other companies who are leaders in this space? What are they doing? And I think that has created a result of companies addressing some issues that may not really be material to them, and has allowed them to ignore very material issues that they would rather not talk about. And so I do think that we are now, with increased transparency, that is going to force companies to say, should we really be looking at McDonald's and what McDonald's is doing? Or do we really need to be looking at, okay, what is the company in our space? What are really those material risks? We don't need to follow what Microsoft is doing. We really need to look internally at what are the risks to us? In addition, where can we make the biggest impact in this space?
And if I could just add, we talked, for those of you who weren't here yesterday, we talked a lot about how, so ESG started 2004, and it was tied to materiality and shareholder value determined by institutional investors. It then came and was blended into the CSR at companies CSR being typically philanthropy on the side, and then it became sort of a mix. I personally would never use the term CSR. And if we go back to the governance at places like Nike and JP Morgan, you kind of maybe 20 years ago, you had a CSR, maybe a committee, you had somebody thinking about it at a board level. Now, at the board level, from a governance perspective, it is part and parcel of audit. It is part and parcel of comp. Something like 80% of in-house counsel said we're starting to tie comp to ESG goals. It is start of finance and strategy and overall. And then the other thing for Dominique is the best companies really have, instead of a CSO over here and a CFO and then a legal counsel, they have a committee, because with all of that combines them together.
Yeah, I think ensuring that the distribution of sustainability professionals is across the company, including in really important roles in finance and in legal, and that is the addition that will happen in the next 3 years as more of this regulatory compliance work comes on board, that will really help companies to start to make that transition.
So let me understand this. So are you saying there are board members that have responsibility for CSR, or is that specific members of each committee? How does it work?
First, let's stop using CSR.
Okay. Can you please explain why?
Because it's meaningless. I mean, in this conversation. So CSR arose for corporations as a recognition around the same time that they were setting up their foundations, that they needed to consider stakeholders in addition to shareholders as they were operating. And that's led to the foundation, let's go plant a tree. It is mixed up in the legal profession with ESG, which was fundamentally defined in 2004 as the factors that are material to operations and shareholder value that are not on the balance sheet. They are two very different things. And one of the reasons we have such an anti-ESG movement is ESG came out, it meant something. It got blended with CSR to mean all things to all people, and now we're in a complete muddle.
Okay, let's go back to... I'll be
Sorry.
careful here. So let's go
No, but
back
Suze,
to...
how do you really feel about it?
Let's go back to the board's role. What positions do you see emerging in companies?
So at the board level, I'll just say, because I worked with Ceres and we actually interviewed 100 public companies, they used to have a little CSR department, and it was kind of like you had your one person of color on the board that was responsible for everything on race. You had one person who was responsible for everything in this area. That's not viewed as good governance anymore. The gentleman from United, he had spoken a little bit about governance and how they're operated United or at Unilever or at either of these two institutions, it is part and parcel of finance. It is part and parcel of audit. It is part and parcel of comp. It is part and parcel of strategy and governance for the overall organization.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think a lot of companies are making that transition. I don't think that a lot, they're there yet. But I think, again, like as the reporting, as boards dive into these areas to really understand what is going on at the company, I think you're going to see, as Sue said, integration of those within the board at all levels.
Okay, and let me ask you another question, especially as the management and board are increasingly engaged in CSR. What are the challenges, do you think, that in public? What are the challenges that you see in public corporations in terms of, market pressures? And I know we mentioned a little bit the anti-woke movements in some, in previous panels. So what do you think, how does being public help you or potentially make it harder to, to think about climate issues?
So I think that there are some challenges to being a public company to be able to address them, and most of it has to do with timelines. CEOs and management being responsible to maximize shareholder value are very focused on the short term, how to get short-term returns to their shareholders. The problem is the timelines, especially for climate, are longer term. So for most companies, climate risk is something that is 3, 5, 10 years away. And so there's not an imperative at this point to address something that is that longer term, even if action needs to occur today. Second, decarbonization, as Sue's mentioned, is really subject kind of to the 80-20 rule, right? Where 80% is not easy, but medium difficulty with medium expenses. The 20%, the remaining 20% is really hard and it's really expensive. And it could take a massive change in your business model. And so similarly, firms that are really focused on short-term returns don't have the incentive to undertake those very expensive and very difficult ventures today. So I think that those are the conflicting timelines is really where it presents the most hurdles for public companies.
Okay, interesting. So I'd like to bring Rama a little bit into the conversation. Ultimately, what these companies do care about, also in terms of sustainability, is also getting the investors on board. So in your role in JP Morgan, maybe you can tell us a little bit how this role has evolved, in part to respond to greater demand for environmentally friendly practices. So,
Sure, happy to do that. So I'm not a lawyer, so I'm nervous in a room full of lawyers. I'm going to say things that are probably going to be somewhat offensive, so I'll apologize upfront. So at JP Morgan, look, we have had, again, this CSR was a term we used maybe 10, 12, 15 years back. We used to publish these glossy reports with pictures of trees and, children in Africa and feeling good about ourselves. We are definitely not in that world anymore, right? So we moved on from that to ESG, and I would say we have actually moved on from ESG as well. Not because ESG is a bad construct, but it just become, to use Suze's phrase, it's got muddled in with kind of, still the CSR world. Again, we are a bank, so we are all about being specific and particular about what we do, right? Everything is about discount rates and time horizons, every problem in any domain. So once you know what the time horizon is, once you know what the discount rate you're using, everything can be framed in a very analytical way, right? So I have no problem. We got subpoenaed by 19 state attorney generals last year. We got letters from 12 ag secretaries this year saying that we are doing, too much, but doesn't matter, right? We are very clear that what we are doing makes perfect sense to JP Morgan. And we're not doing it again to help some, abstract things somewhere far away in the world. It is to help the JP Morgan stock price. As simple as that, right? And we have very high degree of clarity and conviction on how what we are doing today helps JP Morgan, right? As a bank, we have a $4 trillion balance sheet. We have $1 trillion plus, $1.3 trillion of lending, right? We lend to every sector in the world, every part of the world. We are in every state in this country. We are in over 100 countries in the world. So we run a pretty complicated business, and we do it with data, right? So our evolution has been, I would say, pretty methodical, and Suze has been a very good partner all along the way. We about 5 years back almost now, we started this process called, we set up a team. We called it the Center for Carbon Transition. Again, that was a pivotal moment when we said we don't want to talk about ESG anymore as a generic thing, but we want to pick our spots. Where is it that there are issues that matter to JP Morgan? Where is it that there are issues where JP Morgan actually can make a difference? And decarbonization was clearly one, so we picked that. We also have separate, completely independent of me, teams that focus on affordable housing or racial equity and things like that. But again, very separate experts in each domain doing what they do best, right? So we measure in our capital allocation. As I said, we have a $4 trillion balance sheet. Our job is to allocate capital. That's all we do all day. Now, carbon is a factor. It's an explicit quantitative factor in how we allocate our capital. Right? It's not, again, hand wavy. It is, we measure the carbon footprint of every client, every counterparty we deal with anywhere in the globe as a bank, right? And just like we look at credit quality when we deal with companies or individuals, we now look at carbon quality. We rate companies on carbon. And that has become part of how we allocate our capital, right? And so that has led us to, again, when we get these letters from people, it gives us a lot of It's obviously a distraction. It's obviously, a pain in the ass to kind of respond, but we have no problem because we have a very good story to tell. We have a lot of conviction that the story we are telling makes a ton of sense, right? So we get, obviously, we get as a bank, we get pressure from both sides, right? There are people who think that we are going too fast, and there are people who think we are going too slow, right? So again, intellectual rigor and being consistent in what you say, what you do is very important to us, right? And a couple of points Dominic, you said, my job, actually, I fight with my general counsel every day, right? I have a different view. I mean, honestly, if the issue is left to compliance, risk, and legal, I think we will solve for the lowest common denominator. Sorry again, right? I apologize up front. Because only way we can, it's a very complicated set of issues we are dealing with. We will make mistakes. You have to let us make mistakes, right? And I tell my GC, I have the best lawyer always, right, available to me. So let me make mistakes, let me experiment, right? And if we screw something up, and if there's a bad article in the FT or the Guardian, so be it. Who cares, right? Nobody reads those things anyhow, right? So
So what does it mean to screw up? What?
We might invest in a project that somebody thinks is, I'll give you an example, right? Last year, India is building these, big railroad networks because, a lot of freight basically gets transported on road in India. The rail network is very poor. The World Bank was supporting it, and it was, had a lot of positives, both from a, economic perspective and a climate perspective. You're taking, diesel buses and replacing that with electric trains. So far, so good. But what is the primary, commodity that gets transported by these things? It's coal, right? Now, so then you say, okay, am I facilitating use of coal by financing this project, advising the government of India on this? I said, yes, we will, right? And yes, people will complain that you're supporting coal. I said, no, I don't care, right? We think the net, calculus here is good for the country, for the economy. The coal is going to get burnt regardless in India, right? Till they have something else. You can't tell people that, you're not going to have energy supply, right? If coal is all they have available, coal is all they have available, right? So things like that, if my GC was taking the final decision, she would have said, don't do it. Again, that's the right call for a GC to make, right? Because she's looking about the risk. But that's not the right business call for JP Morgan to make, right? So that's an example.
And if I can, JP Morgan is a good example. If you learn nothing else, just don't use the term CSR, because CSR, it's not that it's bad, but CSR is what JP Morgan was doing 15 years ago. Everybody was dressing all of this area in, some of our money in the foundation is going to do good stuff. We're building solar in Africa, great. ESG and what the climate discussion now, this is why it's core to the governance, is how they're evaluating risk in connection with their mainstream lending business, how they're going out with products. That's point number one. And point number two is for lawyers, if you just focus on compliance, you miss 2/3 of this, because regulation is years and years, if not decades behind. Tim's nodding with me, decades behind where your clients actually are on the investor side and on the company side. So it's good that now all the in-house counsel are focused, get it, because there are hard laws in terms of corporate behavior and corporate disclosure, but you will not keep up with either, any of the companies, private or public, if you're just focused on compliance, because you miss everything else that we've been talking about.
Worse. In fact, I think it's worse than that, right? I think regulators know that they're typically way behind, so they're doing overreach, right? And again, going back to my point, if you overreach and if you say you have to disclose all of this stuff, it creates perverse incentives. So we will not, again, back to my point, we have to have room to experiment and fail. And too much disclosure requirements, too much regulation, again, stops us from doing that, right? So somebody, maybe you've heard this, made this comment once, right? We didn't design seat belts for 30, 40 years after the passenger car was invented. Now we have seat belts and it's safe, but you need people to figure out, right, what mistakes we want to make or we are going to make, and before you start putting all this burden of disclosure, it's kind of ridiculous, to be honest.
And if I can, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it depends on if you have good in-house counsel. How about that?
My GC is the best GC I've ever worked with, to be clear.
No, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Just one more point. I mean, so when you think about governance, and teaching this at Berkeley, thinking about on the corporate side, so compliance, litigation, rules on the corporate side of the house, you're really talking at the company level about the board function, management function, how it operates, and the corporate form. And we have these new corporate forms, but in a minute I'll talk about some other options. There's a lot of work being done governance at the asset manager level, and we heard yesterday from Janine at requirements, alternatives to the LP structure, permanent capital vehicles, how you restructure those vessels that are deploying the capital and investing in these companies. There's a lot of work doing there, but I would love for Rama I think most lawyers also don't understand, you heard yesterday about sort of traditional financing. There's also a lot of creative work being done to change the flow of capital to include climate. Rama, do you want to? Sorry to take over your role, but I just know what he does.
Yeah. Look, and I think, you were talking to Kate earlier in the keynote and you used the term green premium, right? So I think that's the crux of all the problems we are trying to solve from our seat is how do you eliminate the green premium, or how do you find the right mechanism to absorb the green premium, right? If you look at the EV market, I think the end customer has willingly said that I'll pay more for an EV versus an ICE car, right? That's where we are. So EVs are, sales are picking up. So the auto sector is decarbonizing pretty fast. That's fantastic. That's a success. But the reality is when we fly, we are all still kind of looking for the cheapest ticket, right? That's what I do, right? I go to Expedia, look for the cheapest ticket when I'm flying. I'm not willing to pay extra for the airline to fly SAF, right?
Well, United has the extra. The guy from United was here. People are choosing that, but just let you know.
Not enough, unfortunately, right? So it's you have to expect again. If the developer of the SAF or the consumer of the SAF, to stick with the aviation example, if they are unable or unwilling to pay the green premium, you can't expect the investor to step up and say, "I'll eat it." Right? It's just not going to happen. The government policies, again, IRA, infra, chips, etc., were discussed, right? All of those are fantastic mechanisms to kind of subsidize the green premium. By the way, by green premium, I mean the extra cost associated with the green commodity relative to the incumbent, whatever the alternative is, right? Whether it's in steel, it's in hydrogen, it's in aluminum, it's in SAF, it's in any market that we look at, it's in protein. So the structures that Suze is talking about is, how do we bring in the appropriate public funds commingled with private funds to absorb the green premium that we know is material, at least upfront. And again, IRA does a lot, but not enough, right? And then over time, you get the public funds out of the picture once the green premium has been reduced through scale, right? That's a model that we are spending a lot of time across, again, every commodity, whether it's in energy or metals or so on.
In terms of methodology, how do you actually do that? How do you compute these things? We know, even when we try to think about valuation of companies, right? It's very difficult. There's a lot of subjective elements that go into it. How do you do these things, which seem to be based on some judgment, and what is the methodology?
There's a lot of there's a lot of modeling, and yeah, some of the folks we work with at Haas do a lot of I'll just speak for them, we price out actually modeling, so how far with first loss capital or government capital you can de-risk. It was something interesting, like the Brown transition panel yesterday. What was fundamentally missing is, renewable energy is good, but you have to look at the steel that is going into, and then the really hard stuff that we're talking about is we now need green steel. I've been to Pittsburgh. Some of these things, if we're going to have any chance for Spencer, of having like an inhabitable world, we have to do that and accelerate it. And so what Rama is talking about is putting together, this is the aggregating the financing vehicles to ensure. So one thing that they do, and a lot of the banks, they're now trillions of dollars, SDG, performance-linked bonds. So they're structuring bonds where they actually charge a lower interest rate if there is reduction in emission in connection with, to encourage, for example, a steel company to start producing steel using less emissions. But then they have to cover that delta within the organization. They're figuring out exactly what that delta is with a reduced interest rate. Just one example.
Yeah, and look, at the end of the day, there is enough capital that will take the risk. There is there is not any private capital that will eat a loss, right? For sure. But if you say that there is a first loss layer that has been sized appropriately to eat the high, with a high degree of confidence, the green premium, but not with 100% confidence, there is still some risk that the green commodity will continue to be more expensive for longer than we think, etc. There is capital that'll come in and say, I'll take that risk as long as I'm getting an appropriate reward for it, right? So again, finding those pockets of capital, putting it together in the right form so that everyone's risk reward preferences are appropriately satisfied is something we spend a lot of time on.
Can you give us kind of maybe a ballpark sense of, in terms of, you said this is an allocation decision in a sense, right? How you allocate your capital in a sense, right? So ballpark sense, what is the magnitude of that these things can actually have on the way you allocate capital?
So look, we have a $4 trillion balance sheet. $1 trillion is lending, let's say, right? That's a drop in the bucket, right? It's a global economy is 105 trillion dollars at this point. The need for capital to put the world or keep the world on track for net zero is about $5 or $6 trillion every year. Right? That's how much capital that needs to come in. So it's not a JP Morgan alone issue by any means. It's about how do we get all the various capital, the asset owners of the world, right? Whether they're the pension funds or the sovereign wealth funds, etc., to put their capital to work through intermediaries like JP Morgan. At the end of the day, we are fiduciaries to somebody else's capital, right? So we have a mechanism to allocate our capital. Everyone has a mechanism, right, to allocate their capital. We have a pretty good sense of how others think about it. We have a good idea of how the PE firms think about their risk and reward preferences. We know how pension funds think about it. So job that we do as an intermediary is to, again, design these structures, tranche up pieces of the financing, and place it in the right hands to satisfy those folks' risk reward preferences. That's kind of what we do. On top of allocating, how do we think about our own capital and what we do with our own capital?
And if you look at on the company side, if you look at like what Nike and back to what Dominique was saying, you have some stuff, you reduce energy use, you reduce water use, and then, how do you fundamentally change your systems so that you are actually processing goods using a circular, a model for a circular economy or regeneration, which is, really, really different from recycling or repurposing. And I was asked for another consumer goods company, I was asked by the subgroup they had looking at this, like, how much I thought this was going to cost. And I'm like, $1 trillion? I mean, you're talking about fundamentally changing every aspect of your supply chain, your manufacturing, your distribution, your and you could see they weren't, and I'm like, no, I'm not talking about recycling. And that's the hard stuff. And that's why, the companies what I think is going to happen in the next 10 years, and I'm watching, is there are some companies, and you heard from Google yesterday, that are way, way ahead of everybody else. And you don't see it as much in their market price, but they are, and United as well, they're so far ahead on this. And as the climate changes and as the risks become real associated with the operations, that's going to become more and more inherent. And then the question is, how do you finance everybody else catching up? Because you can't, they're leaders and laggards, but how do you do the really hard, dirty stuff that has to change? And then you get into a question from a governance perspective and an investment perspective on sort of engage versus divest with the fossil fuel, which is a really interesting debate. But I believe we need to bring everybody along.
So I have another question for Rama. I guess, again, going back to what JP Morgan is doing, a lot of this, and maybe that also relates to the legal forms, which I want to talk a little bit afterward. A lot of what you do requires information from the companies, right, that you are working with or investing in. And, how do you get this information? A lot of this seems to be based on voluntary disclosure, or what level of monitoring is in place? Is there any certifications? What is, how do you know that what is being reported is actually true?
No, we don't. Nobody does, right? You can live your life thinking everybody's a fraud, but that doesn't take you too far. Yeah, a lot of the information we use today is voluntary disclosure, but doesn't it's okay, right? Because as bankers, if there is a lot of information content that I get, right? If a banker at JP Morgan who's supposed to cover company X says that he doesn't have some necessary piece of information and he can't get it from the company. To me, that's okay, but you're not close enough to the company. Why are we wasting our capital with that company anyhow? If you don't even have a good access to get the information we need to make our decisions, right? So, to me, it's the reality is we don't know, right? How much methane gets leaked from gas pipelines. It's an unknowable thing today. It doesn't matter what the SEC thinks or says in terms of disclosure requirements. It's unknowable, right? So the best people can do is to model it out, right? If this is how much gas is flowing and these are the age of the pipes, this is likely to be the leaks. That's the best we could do. You can put satellites on in or drones and so on and so forth. They'll all get you closer and closer, but truth is a very high bar. I don't think we can chin that bar. We can only try to be are people trying their best, getting the best available information that they have access to, using the best models. That's I am pretty satisfied with that. As a aggregate matter decision making, again, we'll always end up in a position where maybe one or two companies were fraudulent or were giving us, less information or wrong information. That's life in every aspect. I don't think that should be a problem we should kind of focus too much energy on.
And we can go back to Dominique because we heard a lot yesterday about, we do now have a much more robust reporting regime. California, Europe, even China, most people following the S2 under the ISSB for climate and TCFD for climate risk. So, and a lot of that information is going to be verified. So you have accounting firms that are scrambling because that information is going to be required to report it, and people's 10K and 10Q here, all of the required reporting overseas, and that's another reason, as Dominique says, that you should that legal is getting much more involved. But I'll just say on the private, before we go to Dominique, on the public company, on the private company side, for those of you who don't know, the Data Convergence Project. Your large pension funds, your large asset managers, I think it was CalSTRS and Carlyle who started it. You have the majority of asset managers, whether they're in the ESG or impact space, we're talking about mainstream asset managers, are now self-reporting data in because there is value to them to be able to assess how private companies are doing. So we've gone from CSR, we're doing nice stuff on the side here, to fundamental, to, okay, for the use of capital, we want to compare one solar versus the other solar. We want to actually get granular on which is going to be better in terms of an environmental output, that ability to benchmark. And so data is really important. The data is improving and graduating, but most people are relying on the data they have, and there is enough data to be able to do that benchmarking now that there was not 2 years ago.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the data is fundamental at the company level too, in the areas in which companies assess that they have material impacts, risks, and opportunities. Having data to be able to make better decisions is fundamental to facilitate this transition. And you can't do it using averages for the industry. You need to understand which supplier is really giving you a decarbonization, right? Like, are they actually on the path for that performance? And so I think, again, controlling's involvement, legal's involvement, for me is a good thing because it is forcing us to get to these issues of like, what is the quality of your data? Is it a manual process? How are you ingesting it? Does it need to be automated? All these questions that I think we've avoided for some time are now being asked within companies.
Look, maybe if I may, look, I agree with that 100%. What you will see, though, right, is European regulators and European disclosure requirements are obviously, higher than the US or anywhere else in the world. What you will see, what you're already seeing, in fact, is a lot of European multinationals are going to start divesting assets outside Europe, right? Because this uneven playing field makes it very tough if you're a European multinational to operate assets outside of Europe, because you're competing with a US company or an Indian company or a Brazilian company on an uneven playing field, right? If you're between disclosure requirements, between CBAM, which is their carbon border adjustment tax, it's creating this very difficult environment for Europeans to operate, European multinationals. You mentioned a company earlier today. They're divesting, one of their businesses. Again, I'm speculating whether this had something to do with it, but it might well have. Holcim is an interesting example. If you guys know that, it's a cement company, European cement company. Very, very strong ESG credentials, very, very strong decarbonization targets. Great, but you can't compete with the US cement companies if you're going to live, by those standards. You just cannot, right? Because again, the end consumer isn't paying more for cement that has gone through more disclosure, right? So there are these unintended consequences we need to be super aware of. Again, if magically all the regulators around the globe, got synchronized, that'll be great, but that's not going to happen. We know that. So in the absence of that, we need to be very careful of these California has some, its own rules, and, Texas has its own rules, Europe has its own rules. It'll lead to a lot of perverse outcomes, unfortunately.
Great. So I want to take us a little bit to legal forms, because this is the topic of the panel. But one question that maybe a lot of us are wondering is that if there's so much going on in, standard corporations, why do we even, what's the real benefit in having a special legal form? So I teach actually corporate social impact, and one thing, one observation that we find by looking at a lot of these legal forms is, there isn't really it's not even clear that, these are necessary in order to do all these great things that Rama and Dominika are talking about. And I guess I'll take it maybe to Suze. Maybe I know you are a big advocate for the benefit of the corporation and the PBC. So what does it add really over and above what they've already discussed?
Well, I think when I think about governance, corporate form is one tool. How the board operates is another tool, how compensation used, how management, all of the things we're talking about, that's all part of, I view governance as the scaffolding around an entity, and corporate form is one. So I don't want to, and I don't think new corporate forms are right for every company. So there are many companies that can do a lot, or most of what they're doing without using the corporate form. So I agree with you. I also, when we talk about corporate forms, we've already covered the PBC and the benefit corporation. I don't think we need to go, and that's may versus shall. For me, they're necessary as a sweet pill in M&A so that you can control your outcome. They're necessary because they promote the disclosure in the private markets because you disclose, and because they require this consideration of stakeholders and the public benefit. So I think they're actually best used by companies that haven't used them yet in the dirty industry. Because again, not the benefit, but the PBC, you get the same protection as under the business judgment rule. So if you're in a dirty industry and you need considerable capital expenditure and your price, stock price will drop if you do it, and you're going to need it in 10 years, this bridges that gap. That is, to me, the number one reason to use it. But second, what we haven't talked about is, I think, an even more viable form, which is the hybrid, the nonprofit for-profit. I gave you a couple examples with Gaza. Again, why you should never use the term CSR, good stuff on the side, the foundation. If a for-profit, let's just say a ride-sharing company in the Valley, wants to do really low margin, high impact stuff off balance sheet, It does it through a fiscally sponsored or an independent nonprofit. So if it, for example, wanted to not, there's only so much money you can give away. That's the foundation, that's the CSR. If you want an infinite amount of good stuff that you can do, you actually sell at cost the service to the fiscally sponsored nonprofit, and they can either through revenue or philanthropy, they can then give it away. But that's how we're solving the humanitarian crisis in Gaza right now. That's not a PBC. That's not any of these others. That is the hybrid form with the public charity on the side. Again, it allows you to do incredibly high impact, low margin work that is off balance sheet. And I can tell you that many people in New York, bankers and otherwise, are very interested in this. And almost every company that has adopted it, it's how SpaceX has been able to take over 50% of the satellites out there in the world. That's how they've done it with this corporate form. They could not do it fully on balance sheet. You can't do all of this fully on balance sheet. So I don't really understand, why do we need this? No, never mind. I'll be quiet.
Yeah, if I may, look, I think it's interesting what you say, Suze. The reality as of today is exactly the opposite, right? It's none of the only folks who have gone the PBC route are the ones who think that there is a positive attribute that they have. They want to value signal, right? Not so-called dirty companies which are trying to eliminate risk. It's exact opposite, right? And it worked, right? I mean, there are two, again, within that category, there is two pathways, right? There are existing public companies that converted to PBC, and there are companies which are PBCs that went public, right? Those are kind of what we have seen so far. Sum total is about 20 companies today which are PBCs, public companies? 22, all right. We didn't do
Not
those
that I
two.
don't follow it crazily.
So I think there is a lot of merit to the idea. This again balancing of these different priorities. As the banker in the room, I'll say, look, you need Suze to talk about. In a room full of lawyers, you need so much back and forth about what a PBC is. You can imagine what the market thinks about it. Not at all. Right? They have no idea. Right? We have done a bunch of these IPOs of these PBCs. In 2021, we put it in the prospectus and highlighted it because it felt like ESG was having a pretty positive reception. So we talked about it a lot. Today, it's a footnote, right? The capital markets don't really care about corporate form 99% of the times. Again, if there is an M&A construct or something and it's a sweet pill, then the market will start focusing on it. There as well, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. Once the market realizes that a PBC allows you to kind of, be a bit more flexible in what offers you entertain, I worry the market will put a discount today on that stock because, that's not what the shareholder wants necessarily, right? If there is, concern that an activist can't come and kind of, crack the whip on a company, the market will probably put a discount on it today. The reason we don't see any of that, by the way, today is because the market hasn't really focused on the issue. And there isn't enough case law. We don't know how many of these things will play out.
I should say that one misconception, though, is that these PBC are truly public companies. So a lot of these PBCs are actually dual-class corporations that are basically controlled by their founders. Now, at least based on the empirical data that I've seen. So you can make the argument that arguably they're not truly public corporation in the clearest sense, right? So,
the private companies, and I think we're out of time here, but I would just say, in terms of valuation, the interesting thing about the hybrid that I talked about with the fiscally sponsored public charity on the side, that has been accretive to valuation considerably because there is it's neutral to accretive to the balance sheet of the host, all of the PR benefit, and huge market. I mean, Flexport with Flexport.org is now more than 50% of all of the logistics for aid, and again, you have it just hasn't been broadcast enough. So that you just have to think sort of more broadly about the governance, and what we're talking about is shifting the governance because of climate.
well, I guess a last.
I think we're
We're out of time. Okay. So thank you very much. It was really a pleasure.